بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. اللهم إنا نستهديك لأرشد أمرنا وزدنا علما ينفعنا وعملا يرفعنا وأحوال وأخلاق ترضى بها عنا يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Alhamdulillah, so a warm welcome to everybody in what is now our 10th episode in this series, which is the Rasa'i'l Readings series. And Alhamdulillah, inshaAllah ta'ala, we shall be going through a reading today of الإنصاف في حكم الإعتكاف by Abu al-Hasanat Muhammad عبد الحي اللكنوي رحمة الله تعالى عليه ونفعنا به وبكم آمين. So alhamdulillah, as I've mentioned before, and I try to kind of reiterate every time we have these sessions, that the function of these sessions is to supplement other studies and readings and the like. And it's not supposed to be a standalone reading, because sometimes there are many things which are left unsaid, and sometimes you only get a clearer picture when you read the issue in light of other surrounding issues and also the wider topic at hand. And also recognize that sometimes there can be further details and nuances and discussions. We're not necessarily trying to get into all of the particulars. Of course, we have done that from time to time, but I just want it to be clear to everybody each time that that's not necessarily the function, i.e., to do like a full tahqiq on each issue. Rather, we're trying to explore these issues and trying to understand the ulama, the debates of the ulama, the function of the rasail, what's being said, why certain positions are being forwarded or perhaps defended, and so on and so forth. And this gives us a good insight with respect to how the ulama were dealing with the issues of their time, and also how they were expanding upon the original principles and masail which are transmitted by Imam Abu Hanifa, how they were kind of reading through the literature and trying to make sense of what's happening. And there's many fawaid which we've seen so far, and inshallah ta'ala we shall continue to see. So alhamdulillah, today's reading takes us all the way to the, I guess, the subcontinent, and we end up with Abdul Hayy al-Lacknawi, who is extremely well known. Of course, he's somebody that that died relatively young, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, perhaps close to 40. But he was a incredibly prolific author, and he has um, many amazing tahqiqat as well. That he has lots of books and he has a lot of tahqiq, and there was a lot of tahqiq generally that was happening, a lot of investigation, a lot of thinking and research, critical analysis of certain issues that was kind of going on, and each alim, each faqih, each individual has their own kind of dhawq and their own flavor. Sometimes in terms of how they are addressing issues. And I'm not here to give a whole breakdown on Lacknawi. We haven't necessarily done that previously either. Um, but it is important to kind of see sometimes the various trajectories of certain authors and to get a sense of their thinking and their manhaj and how they're operating. And sometimes those ideas might come out a lot more vividly, and at other times not as much. So this is perhaps one of those occasions where it's not so much, but there are many examples where you can see that he is really trying himself to arrive at some type of conclusion. And not that he's not doing that here, but just the manner of trying to arrive at that conclusion and the methods which are adopted in order to get to that point are somehow sometimes they are quite indicative of an author's kind of how he is seeing the world and how he is seeing how he is placing himself within the wider context of um, scholarship generally speaking, and then the madhab in terms of a specific reality. He's obviously really well read as well. He's mashallah very well read, and in terms of his research, you can see that he's really done a lot of homework when he is going through everything. Of course, that doesn't mean it's absolutely faultless all the time. I mean, I don't think that we can necessarily say that about anybody, but certainly you can see the traces of that somebody who's really put in the time and effort. And that should inspire us as well to direct ourselves towards this type of endeavor, i.e., the type of endeavor which is truly ilmi. That's the shabah here, where we engage in the science such that we are doing our homework and we're talking about ilm in the language of the ilm and in a meaningful kind of trying to do a meaningful presentation of it. So even the way he structures the text and everything, it's I don't want to say it's novel, but perhaps it's quite beneficial. And that's why in our times we would just say to kind of use the standards of our times in order to present their ilm, because this is pretty much what's happening in each time period. These are all awsaf. They're not. It's that you have the asl of the ilm, and then the wasf is the way it's presented. So that's secondary. That's not essential. It doesn't necessarily have to be like this. Rasail can be written differently as well. But alhamdulillah, let us, of course, I don't want to just talk about Rasail and their function and Lacknawi. Let us try to get into now this reading for today, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So, let's see here what page he starts on. 13. Okay, so Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So let's jump right into this, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And he'll explain to us what exactly he is doing, what he is trying to resolve here. So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. فقال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به وبكم آمين. He says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. لك الحمد يا من هو مستجمع لكمال الأوصاف وأشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت لا شريك لك في أطراف العالم والأكناف. So he says praise belongs to you, O one who gathers all of the perfection attributes, i.e. the perfect attributes. And he says, and I testify that there is no God except you. You have no partner in all of the ends of the or the sides of the earth. It's a وأصلي وأسلم على حبيبك. It's just mubalagha in terms of trying to emphasize that you have no partner. It says, and peace and blessings be upon your beloved على حبيبك محمد المجتبى أحمد المصطفى مخرج الأمة عن طريق الاعتساف وعلى صحبه وآله الأخيار والأشراف. And then peace and blessings, and peace and blessings upon your beloved Muhammad, the chosen one, Ahmad, again the Mustafa, the one who's chosen and selected, the one who removes the ummah from the path, i.e. he removes them from the path of deviation, and upon his companions and his folk, his righteous and noble folk and kin. أما بعد فيقول من لا صناعة له إلا اكتساب الخطيئات أبو الحسنات محمد المدعو بعبد الحي اللكنوي وطنا الأنصاري الأيوبي القطبي نسبا عن حنفي مذهبا تجاوز الله عن ذنبه الجلي والخفي. So then he says, to proceed, the one who has no occupation save the acquisition of wrongdoing and bad deeds, which is, he's speaking from a place, a maqam of tawadu and humility. That also it is a manifestation of the prophetic report that kullu bani adam khata, that every child, that every individual from the children of Nabi Adam alayhi salam make mistakes, right? وَخَيْرُ الْخَطَّائِينَ التَّوَّابُونَ. And the greatest of those who make mistakes are those who repent. So Abu al-Hasanati Muhammad, which is interesting because he presents himself as he has no occupation but khati'at, and then his kunya is Abu al-Hasanat, right? So the father of good good things. He says Muhammad al-Mad'u بعبد الحي اللكنوي. Of course, quite common then, common now, and I guess common in different a'raf as well. A sense of calling people. His being Muhammad Abdul Hayy, right? I mean that being his name, that it's some type of compound kind of name, even though he's not known as Muhammad, he's known as Abdul Hayy. But you see this across different times and places, different cultures, that there's some type of tabarruk with the name of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, that calling their children Muhammad so and so, but they won't necessarily, he's not necessarily known as Muhammad, for except in like some circumstances like this where he expresses it. So Lacknawi watanan, so in terms of where he plays, Ansari Ayyubi al-Qutbi nasaban, that's in terms of his lineage, al-Hanafi madhaban, in terms of his madhab, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive his major and minor slips. He says قد جرى النزاع بيني وبين بعض الفضلاء سنة 82 بعد الألف والمئتين من هجرة رسول الثقلين صلى الله عليه وعلى آله رب المشرقين. So he says, that there's some type of he says there was a niza which occurred, right? So what's the niza? It is some type of debate. There was some type of discussion which occurred between himself and another one of the ulama. So what happened? He said this is in the year 1282, right? So 1282. So of course this is some 23 years before he passes away, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. So he just mentions that this is from the hijrah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasallam. He's just talking about the date. He says في أن الاعتكاف هل هو سنة مؤكدة على الكفاية أو على العين. So what's the debate? Is the i'tikaf a sunnah, an emphasized sunnah, communally or individually? That is it a communally emphasized sunnah or an individually emphasized sunnah? It's وعلى التقدير الأول, which is it's being a communally emphasized sunnah. هل هو سنة كفاية على أهل البلدة كصلاة الجنازة أو على أهل كل محلة كالتراويح بالجماعة. So if we say that it's a communally emphasized sunnah, then is it communally emphasized on every township, right? So every town, he says, like the janazah prayer, that it's just a sunnah for those there to attend. Of course, as for doing it, that's a fard. But the idea is that in terms of attendance, this is sunnah kifaya. Some people do it, that suffices. However, there's also other types of sunnah. Like what? Like the tarawih. He says, "O ala ahli kulli mahalla." So now the sunnah, it's a communal sunnah, but it's communally due upon each quarter of the city. So it's not the entire city, rather each quarter of the city has to fulfill this sunnah. Right? So it's a more so it's almost like the sunnah the kifaya now, which is important to recognize, is of degrees. Right? It's of degrees. Sometimes it relates to cities and towns. Generally speaking, sometimes it might be something a quarter of that city, and sometimes it can be something even smaller than that, depending on the size. He says, فَتَكَلَّمَ كُلٌّ مِنَّا بِمَا خَطَرَ فِي خَاطِرِهِ مِنْ دُونِ أن يتجسس تحقيقه من كتب الفقه فأردت أن أكتب فيه ما يسلك مسلك السداد ويثبت ما هو المقصود والمراد. So he says that each of us spoke based on what they had in their mind, without kind of trying to verify the matter from the books of fiqh. And he said, so I wanted to kind of write out, to try to express what is the correct answer to this question, and affirm what I wanted to affirm to begin with, to express to this interlocutor to begin with. So this is my opportunity. And of course, you see many of the scholars, even prior to Lacknawi, doing this type of thing. Ibn Abdin, for example, another famous example, where after something occurs, then sometimes this is his opportunity to kind of go back and write something. And this is what sometimes ends up happening, some type of debate, some type of discussion about a certain issue. What's the case over here? And then what effectively would happen, somebody would go away and write a paper on it. I mean, that's pretty much what's happening. It's not just about yes, no. It's not just about checking this book at that book, but I'm going to write a whole book myself to try to express a certain perspective on this. So this is what Lacknawi does. And of course, these are all teaching moments for us, as we've seen in different Rasa'i'l readings. This also tells us about the duty of somebody who's a talib al-ilm, and how he has a responsibility, and how he has what's the nature of discussion and the nashr of ilm and the spreading of knowledge, and what that looks like. And if he has an ability to express in a certain way, then of course here we are hundreds of years later, sending blessings upon Lacknawi, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to shower his mercy upon him, in probably a manner that he would not have necessarily expected. So there's all kinds of fawaid which can manifest from somebody who is truly seeking ikhlas, that they are seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through all of their ilmi efforts. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for afiyah and sadad. And he says, وَسَمِّيتُهُ بِالْإِنصَافِ فِي حُكْمِ الْإِعْتِكَافِ. And so he calls it, I guess, some sense of upholding fairness, justice, in terms of the ruling of the i'tikaf. وأسأل الله تعالى قبوله بالتضرع والإلحاف فأقول, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept it with sense of kind of beseeching, and in a sense of with insistence. So he says, so I say, قد وقع الاختلاف في أن الاعتكاف مستحب أو سنة. So this is the first issue now. Actually, he's going to express the issues, then he's going to go through them. So he says there's a bit of a khilaf in the madhab. There's a bit of difference of opinion with respect to whether the i'tikaf is mustahab or sunnah. So is it recommended, or is it a sunnah, i.e. an emphasized sunnah, recommended sunnah being of a lesser degree. وعلى الثاني, he says هل هو سنة. So if it's the second, the latter, i.e. The sunnah, هل هو سنة مؤكدة أو غير مؤكدة? That is it an emphasized sunnah, or is it a non-emphasized sunnah, which is again theoretically distinct to the mustahab, which is of a lesser degree. That it's the sunnah غير مؤكدة would relate to things which were part of the prophetic way, generally speaking, right? Generally speaking, it's part of the prophetic way. So although there is some practically speaking, in the parlance of the fuqaha, and the way the fuqaha are, they will combine between these two categories. But from a technical vantage point, they are actually distinct. So they would just talk about it being more representative of something that the Prophet ﷺ did on a regular basis, like lengthening his tasbihat and that type of thing in the salat. So is this also a specific type of ibadah which is akin to that? وعلى الأول, so if it's mustahab, هل هو سنة مطلقا, so he's kind of talking about the sunnah mu'akkada here. Is it just generally speaking a sunnah أو في العشر الأواخر من رمضان, or in the last 10 days of Ramadan? وهل هو سنة كفاية أو عينا? And similarly, is it a communal sunnah or is it an individual sunnah? He said فلنذكر منها ما يرفع الحجاب عن وجه هذا الباب. So he says, so we'll mention now what lifts the veil from the face of this, from the face of this chapter, مستعينا بحبل المولى الوهاب, right? While seeking the aid and assistance of the rope of the ever-giving master. فها هنا مقامات. Excuse me. So here there are various sub-questions and discussions, so subsections. So he says المقام الأول. So the first discussion point, هل الاعتكاف مستحب أو سنة أو مباح أو واجب? So is the i'tikaf, is it mustahab, is it sunnah, is it recommended, or is it is it praiseworthy or recommended or permitted or mandatory? فذهب بعض المالكية إلى أن الاعتكاف أمر مباح، وهذا القول مما لا اعتداد به. قال أبو بكر المالكي قول أصحابنا أنه جائز جهل. So he says some of the Malikis, they said that it was a permissible matter. And he says, and nobody considered this, right? This of no consideration. He says, Abu Bakr al-Maliki here, I guess it's Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, he says, the statement of our teachers and our scholars, basically, that it is permissible is pure ignorance, right? So he uses like a Maliki now to can negate that as a legitimate position. ولما اطلع على من قال بوجوب الاعتكاف مطلقا. He says, I haven't come across anybody who has said the i'tikaf is considered to be a wajib. He says, بل قد ادعى النووي في شرح صحيح مسلم الإجماع على عدم وجوبه. He says, rather, Imam Nawawi, he actually claimed that there's ijma', that there's consensus on the fact that the i'tikaf is not considered to be a wajib. So he said, I haven't seen anybody saying it's a wajib. As for mubah, then that was also the Malikis, right? So, and that was also debunked. وأما أصحابنا, which is the key part of the discussion here, الحنفية فعلم من اختلاف عباراتهم أنهم تفرقوا فيه ثلاث فرق. So it's known from the different types of ibarat and texts which they have in the madhab that they differed into three groups. فذهب القدوري في مختصره إلى استحبابه. So Imam Quduri, he said in his mukhtasar that it is recommended. حيث قال ويستحب وغيره إلى أنه سنة مؤكدة. So he said, Imam Quduri, that he used the phrasing of it's recommended. And others said sunnah mu'akkada, that it's an emphasized sunnah. Um, of course, it's important when it comes to these types of things to recognize also the various sub-schools which exist within the madhab. And sometimes that has a bearing on what is being transmitted as the madhab position. So equating them in this manner and then doing a tarjih and giving precedence to one over the other only works if you are on one side of that, i.e., that you're operating within a certain sub-school. It's not necessarily an objective reality because it's possible for there to be differing interpretations of a certain issue. That might not necessarily be the case here, but I'm just making a general point. So it is interesting how Imam Quduri does say that it's recommended in his Mukhtasar. Some manuscripts do appear to mention that it's a sunnah as well. We'll carry on reading now, and but I will share one thing with you very shortly about this as well. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Of course, he's not he's not the only one that kind of expresses it. I mean, certainly in terms of the general expression, then it seems that I think Lacknawi will also tell us here that it seems that he was the only one that really expressed it like that. But in terms of a general breakdown and a categorization of the i'tikaf, then he's certainly not alone in terms of it being um, either either something which is mandatory, of course not in the context of what he's saying over here, but in a specific way, i.e. when it's vowed, versus something being recommended. So he says, قال المرغناني في الهداية. So Imam Marghinani says in the Hidayah, الصحيح أنه سنة مؤكدة. So the soundest position is that it's an emphasized sunnah, لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم واظب عليه في العشر الأواخر من رمضان. Because the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام habitually engaged in the i'tikaf in the final 10 days of the month of Ramadan. والمواظبة دليل السنية. And his doing it consistently like this is a proof of its being a sunnah. وهكذا ذكر في المحيط والبدائع والتحفة. And he says, and this is how it was also mentioned in the Muhit and the Bada'i' and the Tuhfa, which are, of course, all significant texts within the madhab. Muhit here would appear to be that of Burhani. He says, وقال الزاهدي في المجتبى قال أستاذنا الصحيح أنه سنة. So Zahidi, who has the Mujtaba now, which is a short on Quduri's Mukhtasar, said that our teacher said that the soundest position is that it is in fact a sunnah. ولم أجد في غير مختصر القدوري أنه مستحب. And he said that, well, I guess Zahidi could be saying this, so it depends on where the quote ends. He says, I didn't find in other than Mukhtasar al-Quduri anybody saying that it's recommended. فالظاهر أنه أراد به السنة. So that which is apparent would indicate to us that he means that it's a sunnah. كما أنه أراد أول الكتاب هذا حيث قال ويستحب للمتوضئ أن ينوي الطهارة ويستوعب رأسه بالمسح فسماها مستحبة مع أنها من السنن. انتهى. So he says that just as at the beginning of his text, he said that it's recommended for a person who is performing the wudu to intend purification and to ensure that he wipes the entirety of his head. So he termed it mustahab, whilst these acts are actually considered to be sunnah. So he says intaha there, and that's the end quote basically. So this is this actually an important point. I have the mujtaba here. It's actually being printed now. If we actually go to this point, what's quite interesting here is that Lacknawi doesn't continue. He doesn't continue with the rest of the quote from the Mujtaba, but it could be that he's taking it from elsewhere anyway. So maybe he didn't have access to the rest of it. But let me tell you now what Zahidi actually says after that. He says قلت وفيه نوع إشكال. He says there's a bit of a problem here. He says لأنه إنما يحمل لفظ الاستحباب على السنة أن لو لم يجعل أفعال الوضوء ثلاثة أقسام أو إن yeah على السنة he says على ثلاثة أقسام فرائض وسنن ومستحبة. He says that this is possible, but he says إنما يحمل لفظ الاستحباب, we'd interpret it as being a sunnah if he did not make the acts of wudu of three categories, i.e. obligatory acts, sunnah acts, recommended acts. So because he has distinguished between those which are sunnah and those which are mustahab, he's saying that we can't actually say that the recommended ones are actually sunnah, which is a really important insight here. Because there are many commentators, and this again it returns sometimes back to how the various sub-schools are working. Sometimes there's simply interpretive efforts to represent what Imam Quduri is saying in a way which corresponds to a certain perspective on the issue. But I want to highlight actually what Zahidi says here, which is really insightful, which is that لكن ذكره المصنف في القدور الكبير أنه سنة, which is just a brilliant kind of reference here, not only in terms of how he deems the sharh of Mukhtasar al-Karhi to be al-Quduri al-Kabir, which is vis-a-vis al-Quduri al-Saghir, which is the Mukhtasar. But the fact that he's going back to Imam Quduri to try to figure out what Imam Quduri meant on this point. So he's saying that because the author Imam Quduri himself in his larger work says that it's a sunnah, وَتِلْمِيذُهُ Abu Nasr al-Aqta' fi Sharh al-Mukhtasar, and similarly his student in his Sharh of the Mukhtasar also confirms that it's a sunnah. He's the direct student. Of course, we have his commentary on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri as well. فدل على أنه أراد به السنة كما ذكره فدل على أنه أراد به السنة. So this indicates to us that he actually meant sunnah here. So what did he do? He went back and said, well, the ma'na of sunnah is actually meant over here. Or it's understood from this word, but we know that because Imam Quduri himself elsewhere is expressing it like this, also his student is expressing it like this. So it's possible to kind of reinterpret what's happening over here. And this is a very different way of the what his teacher is saying. Right? So than what the teacher is saying. So that's really insightful because it also tells us or highlights the importance of recognizing that Imam Quduri is part of a certain madrasa, a certain sub-school, and he is to be understood in a certain way. And if you try to understand him outside of that context, for example, by not necessarily paying attention to his other works, whether it be the Tajreed or the Taqrib, or it be his Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karhi, which is referred to as the Quduri al-Kabir, as we just saw, and you don't pay attention to his grand sheikhs like Jassas and Karhi and the like, and also his students like Abu Nasr al-Aqta', especially when they all concur on a certain issue, then this is highly problematic. Right? It's highly problematic because it's not a fair representation of what he is trying to express as somebody who is coming out of a certain sub-school. But of course, all is fair from a different perspective, which is that we have to operate somehow. So anyway, that's just something. It's quite insightful, and it's something to pay attention to. And inshallah, it can be discussed in further detail elsewhere. So he says, وقال النسفي. So Imam al-Nasafi now, he says في المنافع شرح الفقه النافع. He expresses that Nasafi says this in his Manafi'. I believe the book is actually the Mustasfa. So it's not the Manafi', unless he is actually trying to reference the Manafi', which I believe is a different commentary. But given that he's specified that it's Nasafi over here, then it should be the Mustasfa. So he says, ثم قال في الكتاب إنه مستحب والصحيح أنه سنة لمواظبة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم على ذلك وقضائه في شوال حين تركه فهذان قولان. So he says the same thing, that it's the soundest position is that it's a sunnah because the Prophet ﷺ habitually did this, and he actually made it up in the month of Shawwal when he left it one time. So he says, so these are two positions, and the third position here is وَهَا هُنَا قَوْلٌ ثالث. The third position وهو التفصيل. which is that there's some detail to this question. بأنه سنة مؤكدة في العشر الأواخر من رمضان, that it's an emphasized sunnah in the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan, ويكون واجبا بالنذر بلسانه, and it's mandatory through a vow with his tongue. If he literally vows something, that I vow to perform the i'tikaf, for example, for 2 days. So this becomes mandatory now to fulfill, because if a vow is when you conjoin it to an act of ibadah. So this is when it will be a vow. Otherwise, most of the time, it will constitute an oath, depending on the specific wording. So oath can be with respect to anything. Vows are specific with respect to acts of worship. وَلَا يَكْفِي مُجَرَّدُ النِّيَّةِ. So an intention alone does not suffice. Rather, you have to conjoin it with a literal utterance with the tongue. وَبِالشُّرُوعِ وَبِالتَّعْلِيقِ. And he says, and also by beginning it, and he says, and also by doing a ta'liq, we make it conditional upon something. He says, ذكره ابن الكمال, that it was mentioned by Ibn Kamal Pasha. Of course, there's a bit of an issue here with the shuru', beginning it, that doesn't actually make it a wajib. So this is not a sound, this one is not sound, but he's only quoting Ibn Kamal Pasha here. So he's not necessarily saying it himself. But that's also important to highlight, that it's not exactly the same as other acts which are initiated, which thereafter become wajib, like the salat, like the prayer. If you initiate a nafil prayer, it becomes wajib to complete it. It's wajib al-itmam. And similarly, the fast, the same applies to the fast. The same would apply to something like the umrah or the hajj or something like that. But it doesn't apply to the i'tikaf. That the nature of it is slightly different. So that's why that's not necessarily sound there. He says, وَمُسْتَحَبٌ فِي غَيْرِهِ مِنَ الْأَزْمِنَةِ, it's mustahab at other times. وهذا القول هو الذي صححه العيني. So this is a tripartite kind of categorization now of the i'tikaf, that when it's vowed, it is wajib. In the last 10 nights of Ramadan, it's an emphasized sunnah. At any other time, it's recommended. It says, وهذا القول, and this is the position now which Imam Badr al-Din al-Aini, in his sharh on the Kanz al-Daqa'iq, which is the Ramz al-Haqa'iq, which was also recently published, as was the Mujtaba, I guess, that we were looking at earlier, and as are the books of Ibn Kamal Basha, and also the Mustasfa. So all of these books are now, alhamdulillah, available to us. He says, حيث قال الشيخ إنه سنة. So the Shaykh said that they are sunnah. I would Shaykh Nasafi, because he's the author of the Kanz. He says, وقال القدوري, and Imam Quduri says, إنه مستحب. وقال صاحب الهداية, and صاحب الهداية said, الصحيح أنه سنة مؤكدة. So it's an emphasized sunnah. قلت الصحيح التفصيل. So then he mentions the same tafsir which we just saw. فإن كان منذورا فواجب وفي العشر الأواخر من رمضان سنة وفي غيره مستحب. انتهى. So if it's vowed, then it's wajib. If it's in the last 10 days of Ramadan, it's a sunnah. And if it's other than that, then it's recommended. انتهى. واختاره الزيلعي في شرح الكنز. So in the تبيين الحقائق, الزيلعي also chose this position حيث قال الحق الانقسام إلى ثلاثة أقسام. So categorizing it into these three types: واجب وهو المنذور وسنة في العشر الأواخر من رمضان ومستحب في خيره. Same thing, right? Mandatory for that which is vowed, sunnah for the last 10 days of Ramadan, and recommended in other than those times. واختاره أيضا ابن الهمام في فتح القدير. So Ibn al-Humam also chose this categorization. وجزم به الشرنبلالي في نور الإيضاح, and also Imam Shurunbalali in Nur al-Idah affirmed the same thing, because remember, this continues on after tahara, purification, and prayer. He also has a section on fasting in Nur al-Idah. وتمرتاشي في تنوير الأبصار, and then Muhammad ibn Abdullah Shamsuddin Tumurtashi in his Tanwir al-Absar, he also affirms the same thing, and he says وإليه مال الحصكفي. And also Imam Haskafi appears to also prefer this position. He says قلت لا يبعد. أن يحمل الاستحباب في قول القدور على استحبابه في نفسه، والسنية في قول صاحب الهداية على الاعتكاف في العشر الأواخر بمقتضى دليله، فلم يبق إلا قول واحد وهو الأصح. So now he gives his own conclusion. So he says it's not far-fetched to say that the istihbab which was mentioned by Imam Quduri is simply with respect to the i'tikaf in a general sense. Like generally the ruling is that it's mustahab, as we've been seeing in all of these examples. And he says, what about the statements of Sahib al-Hidayah and the statements of Nasafi, for example, in the Kanz, where they say sunnah? So I mean, Sahib al-Hidayah says sunnah mu'akkada explicitly. The Multaqa and others also say it's sunnah mu'akkada quite explicitly. So he says you can also interpret this because they are talking specifically about the month of Ramadan as it's being in reference to the month of Ramadan. So he says if that's the case, then there's only one qawl, right? And he says that this is the soundest position, which is that wajib for the wajib, sunnah in the month of Ramadan, and recommended at all other times. Which is nice, except that we also see other scholars, for example, whether it be the Karhi himself and also Quduri's kind of discussions there, where although there's an expression of it being sunnah, there's also a sense of Karhi expressing the i'tikaf as being either vowed or recommended. So either wajib or, tatawwu, that it's either specifically vowed or it's just generically recommended and praiseworthy thing to do. Isbijabi in his sharh on Mukhtasar al-Tahawi also appears, he does exactly the same thing, and elsewhere you can find a similar type of thing. So we'd have to explore whether, again, this is something which returns to the various, the trajectory of some of the those who are following Sahib al-Hidayah on the manhaj and the wavelength of Sahib al-Hidayah, and whether other sub-schools have a different perspective on it or not. That's something that we might need to dig into a little bit. But at least as far as the later school is concerned, then this is the correct breakdown when it comes to the i'tikaf. So he's resolved that issue now. So he says المقام الثاني. So the second discussion now, هل هو سنة مؤكدة أو غير مؤكدة? So if we say it's a sunnah, although Sahib al-Hidayah has been saying it's an emphasized sunnah over there, he says, is it an emphasized sunnah or not an emphasized sunnah? وعرفت من المرغينان والعين والزيلعي تصحيح أنه سنة مؤكدة. i.e. that these scholars, Imam Marghinani, Aini, Zayla'i, they've all affirmed that it's an emphasized sunnah. واستدلوا عليه بأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قد واظب عليه رواه الشيخان. That as we know from the hadiths in Bukhari and Muslim, that the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام would habitually engage in this. فإن قلت المواظبة دليل الوجوب. So now there's a potential objection that if you say muwadhaba is then this is in reality that something happening habitually like this is actually an indicator that it's a wajib, not a sunnah. So he says قلت هذا إذا كان مع الإنكار على الترك. He says this is true when it coincides with some type of a prohibition in leaving it. وأما المواظبة مع عدم الإنكار على من تركه فهي دليل السنية. So he says, as for it being a habitual and consistent practice, but it is not associated, there's no accompanying prohibition there, then he says that this is a sign that it's actually a sunnah, not wajib. ولم يثبت إنكاره صلى الله عليه وسلم على من تركه من الصحابة. So he says there's no prohibition and no condemnation. Sorry, inkar would be more like a condemning, which occurs, that forbidding the evil or the wrong of not doing this particular thing. That's what's meant. Sorry, I was expressing it as prohibition. على من تركه من الصحابة رضوان الله تعالى عليهم أجمعين, that we don't have anything transmitted that the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام rebuking the Sahaba for not actually engaging in the i'tikaf. So he says, so sunnah is the most that you could say. فإن قلت لو كان السنة مؤكدة لما تركه الصحابة مع أنه لم يعتكف الخلفاء الأربعة. So now if you say another potential objection, were this a sunnah mu'akkada, the Sahaba would not have left it, right? Which is quite a strong objection. he says, he says, and also keep in mind that the four caliphs, they did not actually perform the i'tikaf. So, whereas when it comes to other sunnah mu'akkada acts, they did them. So why is this being left then? So he says, قلت إنما تركوا لوجه آخر. So he says that actually they left it for another reason. وهو ما قاله الإمام مالك. And he says Imam Malik actually expressed the reason for this. So he says لم يبلغني أن أبا بكر وعمر وعثمان وابن المسيب ولا أحد من سلف هذه الأمة اعتكف إلا أبو بكر ابن عبد الرحمن. So he says, he hasn't reached me that Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Sa'id ibn Musayyab, or any of the Salaf of the Ummah actually performed the i'tikaf except Abu Bakr ibn Abd al-Rahman. He says, وَأَرَاهُمْ تَرَكُوهُ لِشِدَّتِهِ. He says, it seems to me that they left it because it was because it was difficult. لأن ليله ونهاره سواء, because its night and its day were equal. So there's some sense now of excusing them, which Imam Malik here is expressing, right? So some expression of engagement and the equivalence of their days and nights, and some sense of allowing them not to do it. And Quduri, what's his name, Lacknawi here is trying to use that as a reasonable excuse now, right? So he's trying to affirm that, look, this is what we have, which is being transmitted to us. It says قال السيوطي في التوشيح شرح صحيح البخاري. قلت تمامه أن يقال مع اشتغالهم بالكسب لعيالهم والعمل في أراضيهم فيشق عليهم ترك ذلك وملازمة المسجد. انتهى. So he says, I guess Imam Suyuti here. Mm, yeah. He says he says that the rest of it and the way to complete it is to say that they were busy with earning a living and spending upon their families and kind of being there for them. And he says busied by their land and their fields and their work, and it would have been difficult to kind of leave all of that and engage in the i'tikaf and remain in the masjid for the entire period. So again, this is giving another udhr, right? It's providing another excuse for why this is not it's not necessarily something which they engaged in, i.e. the Salaf engaged in. He says قلت ما يخطر بالبال هو أن الاعتكاف وإن كان سنة مؤكدة لكنه سنة كفاية على ما ورد. So he says I say what comes to the mind is that although it's a sunnah mu'akkada, it's communally due. He says فترك الخلفاء في زمنهم لا يقدح في شيء. So the fact that the khulafa left it does not it doesn't change anything, because they knew that it was only a communal sunnah. لأن أزواج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كن يعتكفن بعد انتقاله في بيوتهن. So لما أخرجه البخاري ومسلم والنسائي وأبو داود والترمذي عن عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يعتكف العشر الأواخر من رمضان حتى قبضه الله تعالى ثم اعتكف أزواجه من بعده. So he says because the wives of the Prophet ﷺ used to perform the i'tikaf after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ in their homes. So he says that we have a hadith which is mentioned and included in many many works, Bukhari, Muslim, Nasa'i, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi. He says that the Prophet ﷺ used to perform the i'tikaf in these final 10 days of the month of Ramadan until he passed away, sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. And then his wives would perform the i'tikaf thereafter. So the idea is that the sunnah is being fulfilled. So the caliphs are not necessarily going out of their way to do it, neither is anybody else, because it's already being fulfilled. فكفى اعتكافهن رافعا للإثم اللازم بترك السنة المؤكدة والله أعلم. So he says that their i'tikaf suffices for lifting the duty from everybody else. And that's what he expresses here as some type of ithm, that some type of sin, which would have manifested by everybody leaving this highly emphasized sunnah. قلت ولم أرى من صرح من علمائنا أن الاعتكاف سنة غير مؤكدة إلا القدوري في مختصره. So he said, I didn't see anybody expressing that the i'tikaf is not an emphasized sunnah except Imam Quduri in his Mukhtasar, حيث قال إنه يستحب, which is already what he's mentioned previously, such that he kind of said that it was mustahab. وقد عرفت ما له وما عليه, and you've already seen now what is for it, quote unquote, what is against it, because of the way that you categorize it and the way that he explained it out as well, that he could be referring simply to the i'tikaf itself, not specifically referencing the month of Ramadan or anything like that. وأطلق النسفي في الكنز حيث قال سنة لبث في مسجد بصوم ونية. So he also just said sunnah in the Ken, so he didn't specify sunnah mu'akkada or not. ولا يمكن أن يكون المراد السنة الغير مؤكدة لأنه رد هو القول بالاستحباب في المنافع كما قد نقلته سابقا. And that again should be the mustasfa, not the manafi'. He says it's not possible for him to have meant here a غير sunnah which is غير مؤكدة, because he says because he negated the other qawl, i.e. the qawl of it being mustahab in the mustasfa. So again, he's doing what Zahidi did before. He's kind of going to see what Nasafi said elsewhere, but Nasafi in the mustasfa is commenting on the fiqh nafi'. So maybe that's not the best place to look, but the better place would be to look in the Kafi, which is the sharh of the Wafi, which is the asl of the Kanz. So if you look there as well, it appears that he is on the wavelength of Sahib al-Hidayah, right? So it's pretty much the same thing. So perhaps that's a better way to kind of conceive it, rather than, because Lacknawi here has gone back to the Mustasfa to check that. ثم رأيت في رسائل الأركان لبحر العلوم. Yeah, so Rasa'i'l Arkan also a published work. So he says, I saw in the Rasa'i'l Arkan ما نصه, so his statement اعلم أنه لا شك في مواظبة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم على اعتكاف العشر الأواخر من رمضان. He says that there's no doubt that the Prophet ﷺ used to consistently and habitually perform the i'tikaf in the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan. لكن قد ثبت من الصحابة العظام تركوا الاعتكاف. But it's also established from the greats of the Sahaba that they left the i'tikaf. ومنهم الخلفاء الراشدون. So like the four caliphs, فللاعتكاف نوع اختصاص به. So he says, so there's something about the i'tikaf which is specific to him عليه الصلاة والسلام. وهو أنه يلقى جبريل فيدارسه. So it's that he would meet Sayyidina Jibreel فيدارسه القرآن, and he would study the Quran with the angel Gabriel. ومدارسة القرآن كانت مختصة به, and this engagement with the Quran with Sayyidina Jibreel was something which was specific to him عليه الصلاة والسلام. فلذا كان للاعتكاف اختصاص به. And he says, and for that reason, there's some sense of it being particular to the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. فتارك الاعتكاف من الأئمة لا يلحقهم الإساءة. So he says, somebody who leaves the i'tikaf now, there's no blame on them. Why? Because it was something which was specific for the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. ولذا كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يؤكد في الاعتكاف تأكيده في غيره من السنن. And he says, and this is also the reason why the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام would not emphasize it as he would emphasize other sunnah mu'akkada acts. ولا يعيب أحدا من الصحابة على ترك الاعتكاف. And nobody would blame anybody else for not performing the i'tikaf. Nobody is saying, look at these people, Sahaba, right? Look at these other Sahaba, they're not performing the i'tikaf. Nobody was saying this. فإن الاعتكاف إما سنة مختصة به غير مؤكدة على الأمة. Sorry, he says, um, بل بقي في حقهم مثل السنن الغير المؤكدة، أو كان واجبا عليه مختصا به ففعله لامتثال الوجوب، فلا يكون على الأمة سنة بل مندوبا محضا، وهذا غير بعيد. انتهى. So he says either then, so as a result of all of this, either that it's a sunnah which was specific to him alayhi salatu wassalam, and for the ummah it became akin to non-emphasized sunnahs, right, just a generic kind of sunnah, not specifically emphasized. He says, or that it was wajib, which was specific to the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam, so he did it in order to fulfill that wajib, and it's not a sunnah, rather it's just a general recommended act, as something that the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam did for his ummah. And he says it's not far-fetched. قلت, so Lacknawi, هذا التحقيق كله من عند نفسه. So he kind of just says that, look, he says this whole tahqiq, this whole discussion, which Bahrul Ulum just expressed to us right now, is all from himself. He says, وَالْحَقُّ عِنْدِي هُوَ الَّذِي ذَكَرْتُ. And he says, the soundest position is what I have already mentioned. Right? So what I've already mentioned. So it's just the biggest idea here is the fact that, and of course, Lacknawi you can find elsewhere where he kind of talks about this further. But the biggest problem with this would be that the idea of it being mukhtas to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam is not necessarily something which is transmitted down, but it's an interesting perspective, and it's worth kind of exploring as well to see if this is highlighted by anybody else, and perhaps not. And that's what's indicated by the fact that هذا من عند نفسه, that he is saying this himself, but he could just be trying to express it in a way which corresponds to what is being transmitted down. Like I said, the whole idea of it being either tatawwu, being a generic virtuous act, or it being wajib, and that's only when it's a vow, and there's not really a specific in between. So that's also something that you can see being expressed by some of the ulama, as I mentioned earlier. He says, المقام الثالث, so now the third discussion, هل هو سنة مؤكدة كفاية أم عينا? So is it an emphasized sunnah upon, so communally or individually? He says, فعامتهم على أنه سنة كفاية. So most of the ulama have expressed that it's a communal sunnah لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لم ينكر على من تركه من الصحابة بخلاف السنن المؤكدة. So he says, because the Prophet ﷺ did not condemn and object to those of the Sahaba who actually left it, contrary to other sunnahs, فدل ذلك على أنه سنة كفاية. So, and that indicates to us that it's a communally due sunnah. وبه جزم الشرنبلالي في مراقي الفلاح, and that's what Imam Shurunbulali says in his مراقي الفلاح. والعلامة الطرابلسي في البرهان في شرح مواهب الرحمن وتبعه الحصكفي وغيره. So also Tarabulsi in his Burhan, that's his commentary on his matan Mawahib al-Rahman, he says the same thing, and Haskafi and others also affirmed the same thing, that it's a communal sunnah. So قلت ولم أرى من صحح القول بكونه سنة العين. He says, and I didn't see anybody who preferred the position that it was an individually due sunnah. ثم رأيت أنه قال القهستاني في شرح خلاصة الكيداني شرح خلاصة الكيداني عند تقسيم السنن قد تنقسم السنة إلى سنة العين وسنة الكفاية كسلام واحد من جمع. He says وقيل منه الاعتكاف ورد بأنه رواية شاذة والحق أنه من سنة العين. انتهى. So in the sharh of خلاصة الكيداني, by Qohustani, which is now published as well by as Jama' al-Mabani. When he breaks down the Sunnah categories, he says that it's Sunnat Ayn and Sunnah Kifayat, and he mentions here the idea of the i'tikaf being from this category of the communal Sunnah. He says it's said that it's from this category, and then he says وَرُدَّ بِأَنَّهُ رِوَايَةٌ شَاذَّةٌ. So he says this is rejected on the grounds that it's actually a weak position. And the sounder position is that it's actually an individually due sunnah. انتهى. And he comments here لكنه لم يعين الراد حتى يبحث عن حاله. But he didn't specify who exactly is the individual that actually rejected this. Such that we can actually explore this further. He says والحق أن قوله الحق ليس بحق. And he said the soundest idea and position is that his statement al-haq, right, that the soundest or truest viewpoint on it, ليس بحق, is not true. He says ثم رأيت الدمياطي قد نقل كلام القهستاني في حاشيته تعاليق الأنوار على الدر المختار ولا عجب أنه سكت عليه. So then he says Dimyati in his sharh on the Dur, which is تعاليق الأنوار, he actually transmitted what Kohustani said and he remained silent, which would kind of indicate that you're not really objecting to this, although there's a wajh to kind of think about it. And I'm just pausing just for a second because I did for a while think that this is the Jama' al-Mabani now, which is the gloss, or actually the commentary of Kohustani's commentary on Khulasatul Kaydani. So at this point he says وَالْحَقُّ أَنَّهُ سُنَّةُ الْعَيْنِ. So the Ottoman commentator here, he says عَلَى مَا عَلَيْهِ الْمُتُونَ. So he defends this. So he says this is what the mutun would appear to indicate. They don't say, because they don't say in the matan that it's sunnah kifaya. They say it's a sunnah, right? So he's saying this corresponds to the madhab. He says وَأَكْثَرُ الشُّرُوحِ, and most of the commentaries also affirm this. They don't specify necessarily that it's a communal sunnah. Then he says لكن قال أبو المكارم في شرح النقايا, which I think he might bring out Abu al-Makarim shortly, but he says here في شرح النقايا والاعتكاف سنة مؤكدة على الكفاية وهو صحيح انتهى. وقال المولى الشرنبلالي في حاشيته الدرر هي سنة على الكفاية للإجماع على عدم ملامة بعض أهل بلد إذا أتى به بعض منهم في العشر الأخير من رمضان كذا في البرهان انتهى. I mean, he's quoting there from Tarabulsi, Shurunbulali in his Shurunbulaliya, right? So first he said that Abu al-Makarim said that this is the soundest position, and now he's quoting Shurunbulali also affirming it, seemingly from Tarabulsi's work. وَيُؤَيِّدُهُ مَا فِي الصَّحِيحَيْن, and then he has a hadith about it. And then he mentions another interesting point. He says وَقِيلَ إِنَّهُ سُنَّةٌ لَا يَأْثَمْ تَارِكُهُ, which would make it like an exceptional kind of thing, exceptional rule. وَقِيلَ مُسْتَحَبٌ, and then he says وَالصَّحِيحُ أَنَّهُ سُنَّةٌ لِمُوَاظَبَتِهِ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ, which is what we talked about before, and he's doing a qada of it in Shawwal and the like. He says نقله الشارح عن المضمرات في شرح النقايا ولا يبعد أن يقال يجوز أن يكون هذه المواظبة من خصائصه صلى الله عليه وسلم. So this is exactly what we were talking about before, when Bahr al-Ulum expresses it as being ikhtisas. This is exactly now what he says here. He says it's not far-fetched. So there's something which is perhaps still, left to be desired, as it were, about this. There's something there right? And that's why he's kind of I mean, he has his own way of kind of refuting that, but I mean, it's still an interesting kind of argument, right? It's not absolute. These questions, anybody who thinks these questions are simply absolute, I mean, that's only at the public facing level, right? And of course, in this classroom, we're not in the public-facing level. I mean, this is the level of kind of bahth and research and investigation and discussion and thinking about. As I'm kind of dipping into these different things just to kind of show you. Again, it's not to do a tahqiq of it. I mentioned this at the beginning. It's not the point. It's not the function of the reading, but it's just to give you a bit of an insight into what is happening when we're talking about these types of things, and perhaps it opens some doors of investigation for anybody who wants to kind of look a bit further. So this brings us to المقام الرابع. So المقام الرابع, he says الاعتكاف على تقدير كونه سنة كفاية. So it's being كونه سنة كفاية كما هو الحق. هل هو سنة كفاية على أهل البلدة كصلاة الجنازة أم سنة كفاية أو سنة كفاية على أهل كل محلة كصلاة التراويح بالجماعة. So if you say that it's a communally due sunnah now, as is the strongest and soundest position as he expresses it over here, is that due on every town, like the janaza as we talked about right at the beginning, or is it on every quarter? Because we also have mas'alas like that, such as the tarawih. The tarawih is due um, as a sunnah mu'akkada in every quarter of the city. Right, so in the city, there have to be multiple congregations of Taraweeh prayers, not just one for the whole city. Whereas for the Salatul Janaza, then it's due as a sunnah for everybody in the city. Like so it's not per quarter, as it were. فظاهر عباراتهم يقتضي الأول. So he says the outward purport of their text now, what they've said about this, indicates that it's the first, i.e., that it's upon the town. ففي مجمع الأنهر شرح ملتقى الأبحر, so in the مجمع by Sheikh زادة, he says عند ذكر الأقوال وقيل سنة على الكفاية. So what does he say in the مجمع? He says it's said that it's a communally due sunnah حتى لو ترك أهل بلدة بأسرهم يلحقهم الإساءة وإلا فلا كالتأذين انتهى. So he says such that if an entire town altogether leaves it, then the entire town is blameworthy. He says otherwise not. He says just like the adhan being due on the entire town, not necessarily in every quarter, as it were. He says وقال الطحطاوي في شرح قول الحصكفي أنه أي سنة كفاية إذا قام به البعض ولو فرد اسقطت عن الباقين انتهى. So الطحطاوي um, when he's commentating on Sunnat Kifaya, he says if some people do it, even one person is not due on everybody else. ومثله في شرح النقاية لعلي القاري وغيره. So he says same is found in the Fath Bab al-Inaya of Mullah Ali al-Qari and others, i.e. what? Which is that it's for the town. It's not each quarter. We don't need like in every quarter for there to be people performing the i'tikaf, rather per town, as long as there is somebody performing the i'tikaf, then the duty is lifted from everybody. So it's akin to the adhan, then it's not like the salatul janaza, not like the tarawih. That's the khulasa. He says al-maqam al-khamis. So al-maqam al-khamis, he says هل هو سنة مؤكدة مطلقا. So it looks like he keeps repeating himself, but but as long as you're concentrating, you'll see that he's not simply repeating himself. These are all nuances on the question. So is it generally speaking a sunnah muakkada أم في العشر الأواخر من رمضان? Remember the breakdown we did earlier? We said it was the emphasized sunnah in the last 10 days. So he's trying to answer the question now. Is it generally a sunnah or is it only in the last 10 days? So he says قولان. So he says two positions. نقلهما في مجمع الأنهر. So both positions were transmitted in the Majma. Um, I guess it depends on how you read the Majma here, because because in the Majma' he does actually mention multiple. He mentions قيل كذا وقيل كذا وقيل كذا وقيل كذا, and he mentions everything from the last 10 days. Then he says it's also said that it's recommended. It's also said that it's sunnah kifaya. It's also, and then the soundest position is of three categories. So he also does this type of thing, which is a departure from what the zahir, I guess, of what the multaqa is saying, which is that it's a sunnah muakkada. But I guess he's kind of just using the general idea of, because he says first mutlaqan, I generally consider to be a sunnah, and then وقيل في عشر الأواخر, to kind of say that there's these two positions on it. Right, so that's how he's saying it. وقد مال إلياس زاد في شرح النقايا. I guess this is also available, but it's an older kind of print. إلى الأول, so he also affirms the no, sorry, he says وقد مال إلى الأول, the first being مطلقا. Right, so he kind of you can also see the importance of the nuqaya and the shuruh of the nuqaya. The nuqaya is pretty much studied now in Uzbekistan. It's not necessarily studied so much outside of that, although there are some shamis now that like teaching Mullah Ali al-Qari on the Sharh al-Nuqaya, which is quite interesting because it's not necessarily the most reliable, the most precise in terms of the commentaries of fiqh, but I guess it's he has a nice style, and it's clear, and it's kind of lengthy, and he talks about different things, so it's beneficial from that perspective. But there's other commentaries on the Nuqaya as well, which are a lot more there's a more, there's more interest sometimes, and there's more reliance upon some of those other works as well. Some of the, probably the one of the great commentaries is the Kamal al-Diraya by Shumuni, and that's not published, unfortunately. But the Nuqaya is a wonderful kind of ikhtisar of the Wiqaya, which in turn is an abridgment of the Hidayah. So it's a wonderful book, and it's an important reference. So he says وتفصيل الزيلعي الذي دار عليه مدار الحق. So he says and the detailing of الزيلعي which the truth really revolves around يقتضي أنه سنة مؤكدة في عشر الأواخر من رمضان ومستحب في غيره. Which basically affirms that it's sunnah mu'akkada in the last 10 days, which affirms it's because he's expressing that, then he's saying that this is what the answer appears to be. And he says recommended at all other times. وقال العلامة الهداد الجنفوري في حاشية الهداية, which he also quotes a lot from in his own حاشية on the Lacknawi's own تعليقات and حواشي and glosses on the هداية. لا شك أن الاعتكاف في نفس الأمر مستحب. So he says that the i'tikaf in and of itself is recommended. He says no doubt about this. إنما السنة في العشر الأواخر من رمضان. And again, that's an explicit text now, which is saying that the sunnah is in the month of Ramadan. But again, these are this is not the zahir of what the mutun are transmitting. Remember, that's also quite important. The major primers are not necessarily transmitting this, which is why there's so much discussion about it. It's right there in the shuruh and everything. And it's fine practically. This is not it's not a discouragement from the i'tikaf. That's not the function, but it is important to the fuqaha in terms of precision and nuance in understanding what Abu Hanifa is saying, understanding what the books are saying, and understanding how this could potentially be different to other sunan. So this is why it's very important. This is what he's trying to resolve now. I believe al-maqam sadis now is the final maqam. So he says المقام السادس هل السنة yeah, that's right. هل السنة استيعاب العشر الأواخر من رمضان بالاعتكاف? So he says, is the sunnah to ensure that you complete 10 full days? 9 or 10, i.e. the last days of Ramadan. He says the entire period. He says أما الاعتكاف في جزء منه. Or does it suffice to simply be in i'tikaf, for example, for the weekend? Right, for a couple of days in the last 10 nights. He says الظاهر هو الأول. So what would appear to be most apparent is the first position, which is that the entire period. لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فعل كذلك دائما, because that's what the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام always used to do. ثم رأيت في حاشية الهداية للجنفوري, and then he says that I saw in the gloss of the Hidayah now of Junfuri, again he's quoting him. I can't remember now, I think it's like 11th century, perhaps in the footnotes he actually has a his specific date somewhere. But I think it's like 11th century, something like that. توفي في ربيع الأول سنة 900. Yeah, so 909. So he's like 10th century Indian scholar. So, and quite, I guess, authoritative in terms of Lacknawi and I guess others, if he's being highly referenced and the like. So he says قال الظاهر أن السنة هو استيعاب العشر الأواخر من رمضان بالاعتكاف. So he says again, this is what is apparent, i.e. the last 10 days of Ramadan. لا الاعتكاف العشر, not simply engaging in the i'tikaf in the last 10 days. ولو في جزء منه, right? Even if like a day or so, like a portion of that period. He says روى به الإمام شهاب الملة والدين نور الله مرقده إذ المواظبة من النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كانت على سبيل الاستيعاب. So so the 1 second. Yeah. So شهاب الملة والدين, who is it? He says here Ahmad Shihab al-Din ibn Shams al-Din Umar al-Zawali. So he says this is what he said, because the habitual practice of the Prophet ﷺ would be to do i'tikaf for the whole period. فيكون سنة مع وصف الاستيعاب. So it's a sunnah if you do it for the whole period. ثم قال ولقائل أن يقول, it's possible for somebody to object and to say إنه وإن واظب بصفة الاستيعاب فالقول بسنية استيعاب العشر الأواخر من رمضان بالاعتكاف يؤدي إلى الحرج, لظهور أن الرجال واعتكفوا في المساجد والنساء في دورهن لم يكن من يقوم بأمر معاشهم. So he says it's also possible for somebody to say that to affirm that it's a sunnah for the entire period, this is actually quite difficult, because we're meant to do this. We're meant to do this in their homes. Nobody would be there to kind of take care of the duties of the world, as it were, right? To kind of earn a living or do anything else which is needed. وفيه من الحرج ما لا يخفى, and he says this is obviously difficult, right? There's a huge difficulty in this. فلهذه الضرورة جعلنا السنة وهو اللبث في العشر ولو بجزء منه دون الاستيعاب. So he says, for this reason, for this hardship, we've made the sunnah remaining in the masjid in these 10 days, even if it's only for a certain period and not the entire period. ثم قال وما يقال من أن السنة هي استيعاب العشر لكن على وجه الكفاية حتى لو قام بها البعض سقط عن الباقين ففيه نظر. So he says, as for that which is said, which is that performing it for the entire period is a communal sunnah, such that if some people do it, then other people don't, the duty is lifted from them. He says, then there's a problem with this. لأن القول بالكفاية إنما يصح إذا كان فعل البعض مؤديا للمقصود من السنة أو الوجوب, والمقصود من الاعتكاف لا يحصل بفعل البعض فلا معنى بكونه سنة على وجه الكفاية انتهى. So he says, this is fine if the ma'na of the sunnah now is fulfilled, i.e. if it fulfills the maqsid or the goal of the sunnah or the wajib. And he says, and the function or the goal of the i'tikaf is not fulfilled by some people doing it. So he says, this does make sense for it to be a communal sunnah. Yeah. So because this returns to what the function of the i'tikaf is. So what is that? That's what is he gonna mention it here? Of course, they talk about the hikam of the i'tikaf and the like, but it's about pertaining back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, benefiting from the solitude, turning away from the dunya, and being somebody who is looking to illuminate their hearts with righteousness and piety and ibadah and the like. So he's saying this isn't fulfilled by just two people doing it. He said this is of no consequence. Those two people benefit, but nobody else It doesn't, you don't feel the maqsid of it. That's, you know, and that's why again it goes back to what he said about the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, i.e. that was Bahrul Ulum, but you can see the connection here that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam doing it because of the mudarasa, right? So the mudarasa of the Quran. And that doesn't explain everything because now Lacknawi is going to refute this. So he says, قلت الحق أن استيعاب العشر سنة كفاية. سنة كفاية. So he says, completing the entire period is a communal sunnah. فلا يحصل الحرج. So he says, so there's no haraj. He said, وما أورده من النظر ففيه نظر. He says the thing which he has brought as an objection, he says there's an objection in that. He says إذا المقصود من الاعتكاف هو أداء حقوق المسجد. So he says the maqsid for the i'tikaf is to fulfill the right of the mosque. وذلك يحصل بفعل البعض. And so he says, so this occurs with some people doing it. كما أن المقصود من صلاة الجنازة أداء حق المسلم. He says, just like the maqsid of the salatul janazah is to fulfill the right of a Muslim. وذلك يحصل بفعل البعض. That also occurs by some people doing it. وإن كان فردا منهم فليتدبر. So he's saying, even if there's a single person, so he says, so contemplate it, have a think about it, reflect, right? He's saying that, look, he's saying, what exactly is the function of the i'tikaf? What it is its primary goal and maqsid and aim. So Haddad over there, what he's trying to express is that it's something else. It's not this. But Lacknawi expresses it as, no, it's ada haqq al-masjid, right? So it's almost like it has a sense of the tahiyyat al-masjid type of thing, some sense of like a haqq of the masjid at this time. So if that's the case, then he's right. But is there a wajh for something else? It's something to explore further as well. He said, فَقَدْ ثَبَتَ مِنْ هَذِهِ الْمَقَامَاتِ أَنَّ الْإِعْتِكَافِ فِي نَفْسِهِ مُسْتَحَبٌ. So what's been established from all of these discussions now is that the i'tikaf in and of itself is recommended. وَيَجِبُ بِالنَّذْرِ وَغَيْرِهِ. He says it's mandatory through a vow and the like. وهو سنة مؤكدة كفاية في العشر الأواخر من رمضان على سبيل الاستيعاب. And it's an emphasized sunnah, a community emphasized sunnah in the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan, in a manner such that you complete the entire 10 days, right? That's the fulfillment of a sunnah. So he says, فَإِن قُلْتَ. Now this is a side point now. If you were to say, ما السر في اعتكاف النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في العشر الأواخر استيعابا دون غيره من الأزمنة? What's the secret now in the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام performing the i'tikaf in the last 10 days completely in this manner, contrary to other times of the year? قلت لأخذ فضيلة ليلة القدر. So he says, in order to attain the benefit of the night of power, ليلة القدر, فإنها في العشر الأواخر من رمضان على القول الأصح الأشهر. أشهر. So he says, because it's in the last 10 nights of the month of Ramadan, according to the soundest and most famous position. وفي تعيينها اختلاف كثير على أكثر من 40 قولا. So he says, and as for its specification, he says there's a huge disagreement about this on more than 40 positions. He said, بسطها الحافظ ابن حجر. You can see them here in the footnote, actually. We're not going to read them, though. So he says, العسقلاني في فتح الباري شرح صحيح البخاري فعليك به والله أعلم. So he says, then if you're interested in that, you can go back to the Fath al-Bari where he expresses them all, or you can just read the footnotes here. He says, and Allah knows best. But don't forget also that Abu Hanifa has a position on this, on Laylatul Qadr, and the Sahibain also have a position on Laylatul Qadr. So you know, Abu Hanifa doesn't necessarily affirm that it's even in the month of Ramadan, let alone the last 10 nights. So I think we also have to take that into consideration here as well. That is the sir, is the sir of the i'tikaf, Laylatul Qadr. Of course, that's what they mention as well. That's what the ulama mention as one of the fawaid. But remember, I talked about some of the hikam of the i'tikaf earlier as well. So it's not necessarily realized if you take some of those other things into account, like Abu Hanifa, what he said about it, for example, vis-a-vis the Sahibain and the like, that is it at other times in the month of Ramadan, or is it actually in the last 10 days? So it would depend on some of those types of things as well. And was the function of it the mudarasa, as he was talking about it earlier with the angel Jibreel, right? So with Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam, or was it something else, like actually seeking this out, because that's where the whole discussion of ikhtisas also manifests. So you can see how many kind of different avenues of investigation there are, even in this one seemingly um, non-controversial issue, right? But it's only, like I said, it's only at the public facing level that there's one straightforward answer to the question. And when you're really trying to unearth the depths of the mas'alas and the like, and you have to explore the various, like I said, the various trajectories and the conclusions which the ulama are coming to, and there's a lot that we can learn from all of that. So he says قال مؤلفه هذا آخر ما ألهمني ربي للتحرير في هذا المطلب المنيف ولم يسبقني أحد في تنقيح هذا مبحث الشريف لله الحمد, which is also quite wonderful actually, that he expresses now that this is the last thing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspired me to express here. And he said, and nobody has beaten me, in fact, nobody has been able to actually do a tanqih and explain out this issue prior to me. Like, I don't know of any prior investigation in the matters that I've discussed in this way, in this kind of systematic kind of presentation of it. فَلِلَّهِ الْحَمْدِ. So he praises Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for inspiring him to that. And it just shows you that كم تركوا, كم ترك السلف للخلف, that there's a lot left to do. It's not that the Salaf have done everything, there's nothing left to do. There's always so much development, investigation, tahrir and tanqih, and resolving of issues, trying to figure out what exactly is going on, resolving khilaf and that type of thing within the madhab. That there's so much work which can be done. So there's many doors, and you just need the right type of direction, and you have to know what's happening. And then when the time is right, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can open doors for you. وقد وقع الفراغ منه نهار الأحد تاسع شهر رمضان من شهور سنة 84 بعد 1200 من الهجرة على صاحبها أفضل الصلاة والتحية وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة على رسوله محمد وآله أجمعين والحمد لله الذي بنعمته تتم الصالحات. So he says that he completed it on a Sunday on the 9th of the month of Ramadan in the same year. I guess he specified the date here. Previously, he just specified when the discussion happened. So 84 بعد 1200, so 1284. And what was the date that he mentioned at the beginning? So I just said the same date, but Ithnatini, yeah. So this is actually 2 years later. So it was on his mind for 2 years, and then he finally put some pen to paper, which also quite important. I mean, this could have been purely incidental, circumstantial. It could also have been deliberate because it gives a bit of time to and even if we just assume that it was deliberate, then it gives a bit of time to kind of let things settle in your mind, to kind of think about the various points which have been made, and to think about various areas of investigation, that is it like this, is it like that, and to think about how you're going to put all this together. And so it's good to let things settle for a while. You don't necessarily have to resolve everything immediately, but sometimes it just returns also to authors and their personalities and how they are and how they wish to resolve issues. So that's الإنصاف في حكم الاعتكاف. So I pray that it was beneficial reading بإذن الله تعالى, and inshallah we will meet again soon for our next reading. So Jazakumullah ta'ala khairan. Thanks to everybody for coming today, and inshallah I'll see everybody next time. صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.